Life Audio.
Welcome to Christian Natural Health with naturopathic Dr. Lauren DeVille. Christian Natural Health is the podcast on how to get and stay healthy, God's way. You'll hear topics on nutrition, exercise, sleep, avoiding toxicity, meditating on scripture, what supplements to take, stress management, defeating anxiety and worry, how to reconcile Eastern medicine approaches with Christianity, and a whole lot more. Now, here's your host, Dr. Lauren.
Welcome back to another episode of Christian Natural Health. Today, I'm very pleased to have Mrs. Christy Stutzman with us. Christy Stutzman is a small business owner, a music composer, and a former teacher and a state legislator. She has written for multiple news organizations, including the Washington Times, the Daily Signal, and is a featured opinion writer for the Washington Stand by Family Research Council. As the wife of a member of Congress, she traveled widely on diplomatic delegations and has been a strong advocate for conservative pro-family causes on Capitol Hill and in political campaigns for the past 20 years. She has been a featured radio and podcast guest and a featured speaker at political, Christian, and pro-life events across the country. Her new book, The Spiritual Price of Political Science, connects the dots of political apathy and cultural decline of American values. Mrs. Stutzman resides in her farm in Howe, Indiana, with her husband, Marlin, and their two sons, Payton and Preston. Welcome, Christy. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about sort of the journey to becoming a state legislator and also being, in your husband's in Congress. Like, what's that like, that lifestyle?
Well, it wasn't what we planned. And that's what's so funny. God always has different plans than we do. And as we follow him, he kind of takes us out of our comfort zone and says, well, I want to stretch you a little bit and we're going to try this. So my husband and I had just had our first child in 2001, and 3 weeks later, 9/11 happened. And we had our businesses. I had been a teacher. I had built a business, an online business, so that I could stay home with my son instead of teaching. And so we were doing that. And when 9/11 happened, we decided that, we hadn't been as connected or involved as we probably should have been in our community. We wanted to know who was in charge, and we wanted to know if we were in good hands and if we could help. So we just started showing up to meetings. We took our little baby and we went to different meetings, and we just sat in on, a commissioner's meeting or, the local GOP meeting or just whatever. We would just show up. Right. And when you show up, sometimes God opens doors. And he says, try this. So we were approached about Marlin running for a state representative seat. At the time, he was 25, 26 years old.
Oh, wow.
And so we didn't know anything. We just, I love American history, but I'd never studied civics. We didn't study political science. So, we were kind of out of our depth. But Marlin was a small business owner. And we understood that world. And I was a teacher. I've been in education and fine arts, and we understood that world. And as we kind of said, okay, we're going to try it. And maybe in the future, we'll be able to serve somewhere. We didn't think we would win that first election. So when we tried, we realized that the more hard work we did, the more of a chance we had of winning. And so we were raised in, middle income families. Both of our parents had served as pastors in our churches. So we just knew hard work, and that's what we did. We just worked it hard. And, I found that some of the things that I had done for nonprofits translated into politics, whether it was doing mailers or organizing dinners or, all kinds of things that I didn't know would translate. And so God prepares you with the tools that you need for what he calls you to do. And my husband won by 249 votes in that first election. So it was close, but not so close that we didn't have a recount. And he was the youngest serving member of the House of Representatives for the first 6 years he was there. And I took my son down to the State House in a stroller and went around to committee meetings and sat in on the voting and just tried to acclimate myself to this world that I probably should have known about, but I just didn't.
Sure.
And so I was thrilled to see the process, to understand how it worked, but I was also a little frustrated because it was so slow and it was so frustrating. And I thought, well, this is a good piece of legislation. Why isn't this easy to pass? And my husband said, well, it's because that's how the system was initially and on purpose laid out. And he said the reason it was laid out that way is that if it were easy to pass laws, we would be strapped with so many we couldn't see straight. So they made the process just kind of tedious.
Yeah.
Very careful. Everybody gets to weigh in. Everybody gets to, look at it and make an amendment or vote against it. This is all part of the process of filtering it to make sure that it is actually good for everybody.
Yeah.
Bringing all perspectives to the table, from right to left, from every background and experience. That was the beauty of it. And so as he served there, he eventually had the chance to serve in Congress. And so we went to Washington, scared to death, in our farm truck, and didn't really feel like we should be there. But at the same time, God had opened the doors, so we stepped forward, and it was amazing. It was an amazing experience. And so that's kind of how we got into politics. I've always kept my fingers in music. He's always kept his fingers in business. And we've raised our kids, but and he's out of Congress. He served for 6 years and then ran for U.S. Senate and lost. And so he's been out for 8 years, and I served as a state representative in that time period. Really enjoyed it, but then felt called back to my small business during COVID to make sure that it was staying afloat. And just decided to step down. But I've really had a passion for sharing with people as to how easy it is to get involved. And especially on the local and state ugly see on the federal level, anything involved there is a little less intimidating than the other levels.
Yeah, absolutely. What would you say, and I'm sure you've had plenty of opportunities to Christians who feel like politics and religion should be separate?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting subject right now, especially when you have politics overreaching, government overreaching into our lives, like into our children's lives, into our schools. I mean, it's everywhere. It's everywhere you look. And so it's almost hard to avoid right now. And so when you see how ugly it is and how divisive it is, it can be a turnoff, especially as a Christian. We are meant to be peacemakers. But when you look at the seal of the of the United States of America, you see an eagle. And he's holding in one talon olive branches, which stands for peace. And on the other talon, he's holding the arrows, which stands for war. And his head turns toward the olive branches. So our choice is peace. But if we have to defend ourselves in order to create that peace, we will. And I think right now as Christians, that's where we're at. We are at not just a crossroads or a turning point, we're at a cliff. And the heat has been turned way up, and all of a sudden we're saying, whoa, how did we get here? Well, the politics that we see all around us, if we're not at the table talking and sharing salt and light and being that moral compass, then that's the way it's going to happen. I mean, it's going to be ugly. And so it's really important. And, the founding fathers from the beginning, they made two assumptions as to why they thought people of faith would always be involved. The first assumption was out of self-preservation, self-defense. When you look at the Quakers and the Puritans and the Pilgrims and all those who came here seeking a religious asylum before we were even a nation, they came here because they had been chased from their homeland. They weren't allowed to operate, to exercise their conscience according to what they believed the Bible taught. And so the founding fathers knew that. They were only about 2 generations removed from those first ancestors. And so they were saying, all right, so people of faith, we're relying on you to be involved. Even if it's just walking in a parade for a candidate in a local election, just be involved, be aware, and be part of the conversation in the public arena, in the civic sphere. And so they made that assumption that we would do it out of self-preservation, but also out of preserving it for the next generation. And I think right now, the spiritual price we're paying is that we have been well, I wouldn't say overall, but I would say there was a split in the church in America about the turn of the century, where half the church really, I guess, accepted the progressive Marxist type of mentality towards government, where government was the answer to a lot of things that the church should have been.
Yeah, right.
And so the other half decided they wanted nothing to do with politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a happy medium. There's somewhere in the middle where we as Christians can be involved, and we can do it in love, in kindness, but with reason and with boldness. One of my favorite hymns growing up is "Arise, O Church of God, and put your armor on." And so many of us need to, be ready to be bold in an atmosphere where it just seems so ugly. We can smile, we can lead with kindness, we can lead with love, but at the same time, we can be confident, in that we answer to all of the problems around us. We have the answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the people that are more vocal that are out there, I mean, it seems like there's the people that are very politically active, and then there's the people who kind of sit back and don't do a whole lot. What is it that you feel like needs to happen in the church to make people rise up so that they can recognize this possibly is something that God has called at least some people to? What is it is missing that should be there?
Yeah, I think a better understanding of our founding and our history. And that's why I included in my book a little refresher course of our Judeo-Christian founding. I would say from Generation X on down, there has been a lot missing out of our history books that used to be there.
Really?
Stories of God's providence were in our history books. Stories of miraculous things that happened in our founding were regularly taught in schools. They were included in curriculum. And so right around the turn of the century, America was targeted by cultural Marxists who came over from a school. It was called let me think here. It was called it was a university. It was, that's what it was. It was a critical theory school.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
And that was in Germany. Okay. And they really decided that they were going to reject God, across the board. There was no God. So they were basically humanist atheists, and they were academics. So they really wanted to prove man's ability to evolve on his own past the limitations of man's physical appearance, right? So they wanted to evolve in something else. What's ironic about this is that back then they were thinking that mechanical things and inventions and things like this were going to help man evolve. So when you decide that there is no God, and you decide that you are your own God, basically, and you're going to decide for yourself what is right and what is wrong, and also how far you can go, it creates this mentality that there is an elite. So there's an evolved elite. That makes sense, right? And that mentality. So when you're part of that elite, you know better than the rest of the people what's good for them and what's good for humanity.
Right.
And so they came to America, and they had tried several times in several different civilizations to implement this mentality, and it had failed. And so I read there was a letter from Antonio Gramsci. It was one of these guys, and he was in a jail cell in Italy, and he was writing to his friends, his academics, and he said, the next time we try this, we need to focus on the children, because the earlier we get them, the faster we'll get that civilization. So they came here and they targeted our universities and our colleges, and they started writing curriculum, and they started getting into the media, and they really infiltrated to the point where after they came here and they basically replicated themselves in academia.
Yeah.
They ended up in the 1960s with the sexual revolution. I mean, we had a complete turning away from God, I am my own person. And, all of these mentalities came to fruition. And so right around that time, they started removing these spiritual things from our histories. So we have younger have been raised without of some of the things that were actually part of our history for a long time. And when I look at it, it's almost like it's actually a competition between good and evil. So there's two religions you're choosing. So it's either secularism, humanism, atheism, or, faith in God.
Right.
So my book is to people of faith to remind us that, first of all, we were founded on Judeo-Christian principles.
Right.
We were founded on freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of thought. This was unique in the history of the world.
Yeah.
And so our responsibility, regardless of our level of involvement in politics, our responsibility is to be armed with truth, and it is to educate ourselves on who is running, so that we vet them. And we know for sure. It's easy to do on the level. Federal level is a little harder because they got their talking points, and then they practice them and they poll test them and everything. But when you're talking to someone who was running for school board or county commissioner or town council, you can actually go meet them. Right? You can see them face to face. You can go to the town council meeting and see them afterwards, or the school board meeting. So these are people that are actually reachable. And so what I'm making the case for is, we might be at a cliff, and we might be stepping stones, just like, the pilgrims saw themselves as stepping stones. That's not a fun thing to think about, right? But we have to start somewhere. So let's start at the local level, because that's the front lines right now. So if we go and we meet these people and we say, hey, can I talk to you? What's your worldview? What do you base your decisions on? Where do you stand on this issue? You vet them at that level. When they run for state rep, state senator, guess what? Your name's going to be in their cell phone.
Sure.
And when you call them and you say, hey, I'm watching this vote that I'm really concerned about with healthcare, so I'm really worried about this. Well, you actually are speaking for probably a couple thousand people to that state representative. So you've had that personal relationship with someone who has run for office, has run for the next office, and you still have access to them. So I think that's one way that everybody can get involved. Just take time out to go to a school board meeting every once in a while. Look at their websites, look at their Facebook page, go to a town council, just kind of find out who they are. And that to me is like, I like to think of things in bite-sized amounts, like what can I actually handle? And that's something that everybody can do, but it would make a huge difference if people started showing up to these meetings.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So it's kind of like what you described of the cultural Marxists, where they were playing the long game, where they were trying to indoctrinate the kids and were willing to wait until all of those things took effect. I think a lot of us, I know I do. There's this idea of, but that's such a small thing. Is it really making a difference? And I think that we have those thoughts of, this isn't really going to have an impact, but it's also playing the long game. There's a patience that's involved in seeing as that person rises in the ranks of politics. Now you actually have created those relationships where you can actually influence somebody who's in a position to make a difference. Is that more or less what you're saying?
Oh, definitely. And when you have that ability to reach out to someone who's holding elected office, you can actually, and we've heard this word and it's kind of dirty, but you can lobby them. And actually it's your right to lobby them, because you're paying the bills. You're paying them to represent you. And so you're when you walk, you have every lobby them. In fact, you should have the most clout to lobby them. You should have the most say with them, because, if they don't end up, come your way on an issue, no big deal. But if they end up being a consistent, just difference with you, like you just consistently cannot agree with their decisions, you have the ability to go to other voters, friends and family, and say, hey, I've been watching this guy, I've been watching this gal. They're not lining up. Maybe we should talk about running someone else and supporting someone else. That's conversations that we need to have. And, a lot of times, my grandmother was this mentality, and I'm sure a lot of our grandparents were, maybe our parents, that said, no religion or politics at the table. Well, when we see our kids being inundated with literally politics, but also an opposite religion in our schools. I think if we don't take every opportunity to talk about politics and religion with them, somebody else is going to, and they already have. So I think we've got to just kind of, first of all, arm ourselves with, what we believe and why, and then start talking to our kids about it and allow them to debate us. I mean, they will push back. That's what kids do, So if we're ready to talk about it, and we're armed with that, and we open up the conversation, it really can guide their thinking and help them to make those decisions for the future. But yeah, I mean, you can be very effective as a voter, just your average, hardworking American voter, you can be very effective. In fact, I'll tell you a little story. So when my husband was first elected into a state rep seat, he was a year and a half old little boy. And I had a mom call me one day, and she said, "Have you heard about this bill they're coming up with? It's like booster seats, and it's ridiculous. They're going to have our kids in booster seats till they're 12 years old." And I said, "Really? What?" So she sent me the information. She was right. The potential was there, especially for smaller built kids. They were going to make them be in booster seats. And she's like, "What are they going to do? They're going to stop me by the side of the road and weigh my child and measure them? And are they going to have IVs and everything?" She was irate. And I said, "Well, what? I mean, sure, let's have my husband look at it." And she said, "Well, we're going to rally." Well, she called all of her friends. And I'm telling you, I have never seen legislators more intimidated in my life. These moms showed up with, hauling huge booster seats and diaper bags and strollers and kids. And there was probably like 100 of them. And they had a microphone, and they weren't mad. They were just like very bold. "We don't want this bill to be passed. We love our kids, but this is ridiculous, And what I found out was there was federal money being waved in front of the legislators saying, "If you pass this, we'll get, and you implement this program, we'll give you this money if you pass it." Well, it was just more federal overreach. And so they came prepared, and they lobbied the legislators that day with their kids in strollers and diaper bags and booster seats. And they had cookies they were giving out to all the legislators. I've never seen so many legislators look over the balcony and go, "What is going on down there?" And it was moms who weren't paid to be there. They weren't lobbyists. They didn't have time to do this. They were busy. That held a lot of sway with those legislators, because all of a sudden they were looking at people they weren't used to seeing, that had taken out of their busy schedules, who were very concerned, who had done their homework, who knew what they were talking about. And they were there to lobby their legislators. It was an amazing, amazing thing to watch.
Yeah, that is amazing. And did those moms find out the results of their efforts? Like, were they able to look back and be like, "Oh, that worked"? Can you tell, or do you know?
Yeah. In fact, that same group decided they were going to be more active in the future. And now they've created a group down in Indianapolis, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, but they've got a group, and they brought in all these speakers to come in and speak to their kids who are now teenagers and in college. They're bringing these speakers in to speak to their kids because they want them to hear people who are influencing the culture. So they're still active. Yeah.
That's awesome. Cool. So I think part of the reason, going back to what you said about the old, like, no politics or religion at the table kind of a thing, I think the reason why most people typically think that is because it usually gets angry and heated and kinds of things. So how do we as believers engage in these conversations and also love the person? Like, how do we balance that?
Yeah, I think, it just goes back to scripture, where you just, first of all, you have to know, what you believe and why. But one thing that I found is very effective is asking pointed questions with people, not really arguing as much as just saying, "Well, have you thought about it this way?" Or just say, "Well, what do you think about this? Well, where did you get your information? And how did you come to that conclusion?" Just really asking pointed questions like that. I was in a caucus meeting one time, and all these guys had pretty much decided before they went in there that they were going to do something that I felt was not right. And they were trying to sell us on this idea. And the guy that was trying to sell us on it was really showing some hypocrisy in the situation. So I stood up and I said, "It doesn't really add up for me, but could you help me understand? How can you do this, but also do this?" That's all I said. Well, there and explaining and everything. I just sat down, I just talked.
Yeah.
But it's how you approach it. My dad he was raised on a farm where they had to feed a lot of chickens, and his dad taught him, he said, the same feed that gathers the chickens can scatter them if you throw it wrong.
Very good point. Yeah.
It's all in how you present it.
Right.
So most Christians, gets very almost self-righteous in these discussions, and they look at the party as the answer or a candidate as the answer. You've got to keep in mind, God is the ultimate answer. He is the answer. He's the truth. So keep the truth in mind. But then also you can have a civil dialogue with family, with friends, with love, with a smile on your face, but you can still be bold about truth. Now, when they start attacking the truth, I think that's where we can be a little more aggressive and say, whoa, wait a minute. Where do you find that answer? That's, here's the truth. Then be prepared with it. But I think a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this myself, we get lazy with, not doing our research. And then we get into a conversation where we're not really quite prepared, and then we're backpedaling and we're trying to figure out, oh, how did I do this? So it's easy to do that. So I would say before you open up conversations with people, do your research, know what you're talking about. But then don't be so eager to present it that you're not willing to listen to what they have to say as well. Listening is a key to winning people to the side of truth.
Right. Yeah. It's just that kind of essentially putting yourself in a position of humility as so that it's not all about you being right. Even if obviously you're going to think you're right if you're going into a conversation like that. But at the same time, it's not about you making your point, making sure the other person feel like the normal human interaction, make them feel like they're valued as a person so that they're then willing to listen back to you more or less.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Very cool.
Yeah. And, with our kids, when we do that, we are doing we're teaching them how to have a civil dialogue. Right. I mean, with all the keyboard warriors we have today, they don't really have a good example of how to do that. Yeah. So we can example that to our kids as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's so much of the interaction online. If you hide behind a keyboard, it's so much easier to be nasty to each
terrible.
But and people don't in person seem to want to engage in political conversations anymore because there's this fear that you're going to offend. But that we've lost the art of that. So absolutely. Yeah. Going back to something you said at the beginning, you were talking about how our history books used to have all of these miraculous stories. Can you tell us one or two of them that have been lost?
Yes. I mean, oh man, there's so many, but I think some of my favorites were where God just intervened with weather. There were several different battles where God just kind of, they didn't know what was going to happen. And all of a sudden this fog descended and, the other side couldn't see them and they were able to escape. There's several instances where that happened, or really bad storms that kept the British boats and their ships from coming, in and landing. And so they had to go further up the coast, which gave this city time to prepare. There's so many stories like that during the Revolution. But, there's also miraculous stories like the Pilgrim Fathers, when they went from England to Holland. And then they decided, well, even their ship got stuck in the mud, and their women and children were taken into custody. And the men were separated from the women, and they were all going to be sent to prison. And somehow, miraculously, the judge decided, no, let the women and children go meet the men in Holland. Not at all what he was supposed to. And they were just looking at each other like, how did that happen? We were caught. We were supposed to go to jail. But on their way over from, they stopped in England. They had two ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. And when they got to probably less than a day's, journey outside of England, Speedwell started taking on water and they didn't know what was wrong with them. Well, the Speedwell was the boat that they had bought. The Mayflower was the one they kind of rented. And so they went back into the port and they had to look at it and they put it into dry dock and they're trying to fix it. This is delaying their trip by months, right? So they're waiting and waiting. And finally they decide this speedwell is just not seaworthy.
Right.
Can't take it.
Yeah.
The ship that you bought, you can't take.
Mm-hmm.
So now what are they going to do? Well, they split their group into half, and
Uh-huh.
they half of them get on the Mayflower, and half of them stay there and say goodbye. One of them was Bradford and his wife. They left their son actually in Holland, and again, they were leaving their pastor. I'm trying to remember his name, but so they left very dear people there, and then half of them got on the Mayflower. So they took off, right? And so halfway over, of course, because of the month's delay, they run into a very bad storm called a westerly.
Uh-huh.
And the main beam of the ship gets cracked.
Mm-hmm.
And just for some reason, William Brewster had brought this huge giant iron screw. It was supposed to be for a printing press. And he probably brought it because he didn't think he could replicate it in the New World. They didn't have to do that. So they took this iron screw and they put it underneath the beam and they screwed it into place.
Oh, wow.
Saved the ship.
Yeah.
Came here with that in place, right? Yeah. So then, because they rented the ship, they're there in the middle of winter, no shelter, nothing in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And they finally decide on, we're going to go look for land. So they start looking for land, and they're looking for the natives there to make a deal and buy land from them or something. Mm-hmm. And it took probably a month. Mm-hmm. And the ship's captain decided he was going to stay there and give them shelter until they had built shelter. Again, a miracle. This guy wasn't a pilgrim. He wasn't one of them, and he was supposed to be back months before. Right. And he decided to stay there, give them shelter, allow them to survive. Another amazing story is when Squanto just walks into their village, right? Just walks village and he's speaking English. Uh-huh. He's speaking English. He helps them survive the first winter. How did he learn English? Well, he was enslaved by English slave merchants and took him over to England. And then he was he was taken around almost like this, this great attraction, and he learned English while he was there. And then somehow he came back and his village was gone. They had been decimated by disease. Yeah. And so he had, kind of acclimated to another place, but he walked in speaking English, helped save them. Yeah. And there's just so many stories like that. There was a pastor who was fighting a battle, and he was leading his men. It was a regiment in the Revolution. This is up in New Jersey, and they've got a monument to him and stuff. But they didn't have any wadding for their guns. No wadding. Mm-hmm. They had bullets, but none of the paper to put in it. Right. Mm-hmm. So he goes over to his church, grabs the hymnals, takes them out, starts ripping out the hymnals. And he handed them to the men, and he said, "Give them Watts, boys," because it was Isaac Watts' hymnal. And they started stuffing hymns, into their guns. And they won this it was a little tiny town, and it was a huge victory for the Americans. And it was all because people just came together and helped each other and used what they could, to defend themselves at risk of their own families and friends and everything else. So, when you think about risking, like taking a risk and saying, I could offend somebody. Well, when you look at Christ, you look at the disciples, you look at the apostles, how many times did he offend the religious people, not to mention the governmental people? Right. So many times. So I think we have to realize that, it's kind of par for the course, as being a Christian, is that you say it as lovingly as you can, but the truth is going to offend people who do not want to hear it. Mm-hmm. And so even if you say it kindly, there will be those who don't receive it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I love the fact that there's all of these stories that we can bring back to the forefront. And I'm wondering if there was a coincidence, or at least it was part of a progression of removing that from the history text and also removing prayer from the schools. Seems like this is and also, the doctrine of evolution that has become more and more ingrained. All of this seems like a concerted effort to make people think that God is irrelevant, which then leads people to believe in things like cultural Marxism that will then make it seem as if Christianity is completely irrelevant. But when you look back at the stories of how much God intervenes and how powerful prayer actually is and has been and can still be, it's one of those things to stir up at least those people who are already people of faith to say, no, we really can make a difference. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep.
So what role, that was a progression from a, educational standpoint. How about the media? To what degree does mainstream media versus alternative media streams play a role now in terms of shaping the cultural dialogue?
I think the mainstream media still has a strong effect.
Yeah.
It has the broadest reach.
Yeah.
But I'm so thankful for alternative media that we have.
Right.
I think it's a new way of spreading truth and really getting the information that we need. In my book, I provide reliable resources, and it's just like 3 pages worth of links and even like little blurbs about what they're good at and what their proficiency is and what to go through for them. And it's really important because I think a lot of times we don't know where to go to get good information.
That's true. Yeah.
We don't know who to trust, and it's scary, and we don't want to be some conspiracy theorist, believing everything that comes down the pike.
Sure.
But at the same time, there seems to be a lot of talking points that don't line up with what we're seeing in front of us.
Right. Exactly.
So that kind of makes you doubt, well, okay, I don't know. I'm not going to be too ready to believe that right now until I find out more details. And I think we just have to be diligent to do our research, know who to trust. Yeah. And there are great groups out there, so many great groups who are providing good information. Right. They're just kind of overshadowed by the mainstream media. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, we just have to be diligent and do our own research. And I would encourage people, online is great. It's great. Yeah. But just make sure that even your online resources are referenced, that you have a reference to where they get their information. Yeah. Because a lot of times it can sound so good and so believable. Right. And it's not based in actual, fact and hasn't been documented.
Yeah. And especially these days, the possibilities of disinformation all across the board, like it really is incumbent upon us to do our due diligence for sure.
Yeah.
And so if people don't, like if Christians did not rise up and start actually taking back, re-emphasizing what the spiritual principles are into our political arena, where do we see this going? Like what's at stake here?
Well, like I said, I mean, when you're hanging over a cliff and people are hanging onto your legs trying not to fall, sometimes you have to see yourself as saying, okay, climb over me, just go ahead. I'm going to be a stepping stone. I think that's where we're at right now. I think I've been encouraged as I'm doing interviews about my book across the nation, I'm hearing people tell me, we're having a revival at our little college down the road, or I think there's a spiritual renewal going on at our high school, or it's just all over the place. And I'm starting to see pockets of the spiritual renewal. Yeah. Honestly, I think it's based in the fact that this generation has been the most bereft generation of truth and, God's light, that it's been withheld from them in many different ways, and they've been inundated with other things. Right. And so when you've been starved for something and you finally have a taste of it, it's like you can't get enough. Right. They're running toward it when they find it. Yeah. And we're seeing that, and that's what's encouraging to my heart right now, is that we are seeing this this thirst, for what is truth, what is my purpose? What is my cause on this earth? What should I be doing? And when they find that, they get on fire for God, and it's amazing to watch. Yeah. In different, little pockets around the country. So I'm praying that continues. Yeah. But I think what's at stake right now is two things. First of all, I went on a diplomatic mission with my husband when he was in Congress, and we went to the Eastern Bloc countries that used to be part of the USSR. We went to Israel, and we heard the same thing everywhere we went. And that was, first of all, thank you. As an American leader, I want to thank you as a citizen of, name the country, right? Yeah. I want to thank you for being a good influence and light to the world. You have done so much good. Yeah. Thank you for your missions. Thank you for your educational outreaches and your healthcare provisions and your disaster relief and just so many things that we have done around the world. Thank you so much. But please don't stop. Yeah. If you stop, I don't know who's going to take your place. I don't know who's going to do what you have done.
Mm-hmm.
So it was encouraging, but discouraging at the same time. Encouraging to realize that the vision of the founders, the vision of the people that came here seeking religious asylum, their hope that someday we would go throughout the world and be salt and light actually happened. Yeah. So that's good, right? But the sad part is that they're watching the foundations crumble and they're wondering, how long is it going to last? That's what's at risk. Our children, you know, that's what's at risk. I see our children, they're hungering for truth, but also so many of them lost. They don't even know where to go. Right. And they're being inundated with this, you know, this culture that is humanistic, atheistic, and Marxist, really. So when you see that, you see these uprisings, right? So we've had some demonstrations on college campuses, and we've had, you know, cities that are being, you know, ransacked and pillaged or whatever. I really see that as a result of an anarchy of the mind. If you don't understand the order of nature and how God designed everything, if you don't accept that and you're raging against any type of authority that represents God, you will rage against police, you will rage against, you know, your professors, your parents, anything that smacks of authority, because you're trying to fight for your own authority, but that creates an anarchy in your mind. Who's in charge? No one's in charge. And you don't know where to go. And there's this disconnect as you as a human to know where you belong and what you should be doing and what your purpose is. So we're losing our kids and we're also losing our influence around the world. So that's what's at stake. So when we look at it that way, from a biblical perspective, man, taking a few hits because we stand up for something politically is nothing compared to what we could lose, you know, potentially.
Yeah, that's a really good way to look at it, that this is not, it doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be, a selfish pursuit. This is our legacy to the world and our legacy for the future generation that we're actually doing this for. But while also keeping in mind loving the person that's in front of you as much as possible and doing our part. What have I not asked you that you want to make sure that you leave with our audience?
Oh, well, you know, I have a little story, so I'll share that with you. It's never wrong to stand up for right. And my grandmother, she's my 7 times great grandmother. I was doing some ancestry research, and she was this little Quaker lady who just loved on people. You know, she just went around and took care of the sick and the poor and the needy. Have some letters from her, just really, really dear lady. But she had served on the National Register because she helped Anthony Wayne during the Winter of Valley Forge, and she ministered to his soldiers, his regiment, and he was her first cousin. And so there's so many really neat stories, but this little Quaker lady, you know, lived on a farm and just loved God and tried to help people. On her deathbed, her husband recorded that her last words, she looked up at her family and she said, "Be valiant for truth." And if I could leave you with that, I would just encourage you. There's nothing else to be valiant for but truth. And the word valiant, that's a war term coming from a Quaker lady. So, you know, to me, it was like, wow, okay, she really felt passionate about this. Valiant means you are courageous, you're bold, you're confident, you know, you're going to fight for a cause. And I thought, what other thing should we fight for than truth? And realize that there's not just my truth or your truth or God's truth. And that's what we should always stand up for, is to be valiant for truth.
Absolutely. So where can people go to learn more about you and to get a copy of your book?
Yeah, I have a website. It's called booksbychristy.org and CHRSTY. And you can also find it on Amazon, christianbooks.com, anywhere online. There's going to be an audiobook. I'm recording that in July. So hopefully that's going to be available probably in the fall. So if you listen to audiobooks, that'll hopefully be available soon. But just, you know, I just encourage people to take a look at it. It's an easy read. I kept the chapters really short. Several of my friends have told me, they're like, just keep the chapter short, because if you do that, I feel accomplished when I read a chapter. And I was like, okay.
Check the box. Yep.
So the chapters are short. It's broken up into, you know, sections or whatever, but it really is just like a practical hand guide for anybody. And it's non-denominational. It's It's nonpartisan. I even included excerpts from the Republican platform, the Democrat platform, links to the Libertarian and the Green Party, so that everybody can look at it and say, okay, where do I line up? There's not one perfect party. Not one party is the answer. But where do I line up? And where's the closest thing to what I believe? And that way you can see for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Love it. Thank you, Christy. This has been really a great conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Are you looking for a holistically minded healthcare practitioner who truly treats root cause rather than symptom suppression? Unfortunately, even in the alternative healing professions, this isn't a given. That's why I've created wholehealthdoctor.com, a resource to help connect patients to healthcare practitioners in their area who share a root cause philosophy. Alternatively, most of the practitioners listed also practice telehealth. So if there isn't anyone local to you, you can still find a great practitioner to help you regain optimal health. Go to wholehealthdoctor.com. That's wholehealthdr.com. Type in your location or adjust the specialty that you're looking for and find the practitioner who's right for you.
Thanks for listening to Christian Natural Health. This show is run by you, so please write in with topic and guest suggestions for future shows. For more great content, subscribe to Dr. Lauren's blog at www.drlaurendeville.com or follow her on Facebook or Twitter at Dr. Lauren DeVille. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to share it with your friends and give us a 5-star rating in iTunes. It really helps us to stand out so other people can discover great content as well. Have a great week and God bless you.